The movie's dark tone. When Blade was released, its darker tone helped separate it from many other superhero films. The movie embraces violence, horror imagery, supernatural creatures, and a serious atmosphere. It does not attempt to make Blade a cheerful or traditional superhero. The darkness serves a purpose. Blade's world is dangerous. The vampires are predators. The protagonist has experienced trauma. And the stakes are frequently life or death. This tone helps create a sense of urgency throughout the film. The movie also uses darkness visually. Nighttime environments, industrial locations, underground spaces, and dimly lit interiors create an atmosphere that feels appropriate for a story about creatures that hide from daylight. The visual style contributes heavily to the movie's identity, the famous Blood Club sequence. One of the film's most memorable sequences takes place inside a vampire nightclub. At first, the location appears to be a normal place of entertainment. But Blade knows what it really is, a gathering place for vampires. The scene builds tension by allowing the audience to understand that Blade has entered enemy territory. Then everything erupts. The sequence demonstrates the movie's ability to combine music, atmosphere, choreography, special effects, and action. It is also a perfect introduction to the hidden vampire society because the vampires are not hiding in an isolated castle. They are living openly among people, disguised by modern nightlife. Blade's arrival turns the club into a battlefield. The sequence remains one of the strongest examples of the movie's energetic visual style. Blade's personal motivation. Although the movie contains plenty of action, Blade's motivation is deeply personal. He has dedicated his life to fighting vampires because he understands the destruction they cause. This is important because it prevents the character from feeling like a hero who simply happens to have superpowers. Blade has a reason to fight. His abilities come with consequences, and his life is defined by the conflict between his humanity and the vampire world. This gives his character a tragic quality. The more successful Blade becomes at hunting vampires, the more isolated his life becomes. He cannot simply return to normal society. His mission has consumed him. Yet he continues because stopping the vampires is more important to him than having an ordinary life. The transformation of the threat. As Frost's plan develops, the danger becomes increasingly serious. The story shifts from individual vampire attacks to a larger supernatural threat. Blade realizes that Frost is not simply another enemy. He is attempting to achieve something that could fundamentally change the relationship between humans and vampires. This raises the stakes. If Blade fails, the consequences could extend far beyond his personal life. The final act therefore becomes a race against time. Blade must confront increasingly powerful enemies while also dealing with the consequences of his own condition. The film builds toward a confrontation in which Blade's physical abilities, experience, determination, and knowledge of vampire weaknesses all become essential. The final confrontation. The climactic confrontation between Blade and Frost provides the payoff for the entire story. Everything the movie has established comes together: Blade's hatred of vampires, Frost's ambition, ancient mythology, supernatural power, and the question of what happens when someone attempts to transcend the boundaries of their species. The confrontation is not simply about defeating a villain. It represents Blade's rejection of the vampire world. Frost wants to embrace power. Blade wants to destroy the system that created him. Their conflict therefore reflects the movie's central theme of identity. Who has the right to define Blade? The vampires? Human society? Or Blade himself? His answer is revealed through his actions. Why Blade felt different in 1998. One of the biggest achievements of Blade is that it did not feel like a conventional superhero movie. It was a superhero story disguised as a vampire action film. That combination allowed it to reach audiences who might not normally seek out comic book adaptations. The film offered martial arts. It offered horror. It offered supernatural mythology. It offered science fiction elements. And it offered a powerful central character. This genre mixture gave Blade its own personality. Rather than trying to imitate traditional superhero storytelling, the movie created its own world. That was a major reason it stood out. Commercial success. Blade was made with a reported budget of approximately $45 million and ultimately earned around $131 million worldwide. That commercial performance was significant. The movie demonstrated that a Marvel character could lead a successful theatrical action film even without the mainstream recognition enjoyed by characters such as Batman or Superman. Its success also helped establish confidence in Marvel-based filmmaking. At the time, audiences did not know that superhero movies would eventually dominate Hollywood. But Blade became one of the important films showing that comic book adaptations could work when filmmakers treated the material seriously. A major moment for Marvel. It is difficult to discuss the history of Marvel movies without recognizing the importance of Blade. The film arrived years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There was no interconnected MCU storyline. There were no post-credit scenes designed to tease dozens of future films. There was no established Marvel Studios formula. Instead, Blade had to succeed on its own. And it did. Its success demonstrated that comic book characters could be adapted into mature, visually distinctive action films. That achievement helped create a path for future Marvel adaptations. The movie's influence is therefore larger than its individual box office performance. The legacy of Wesley Snipes' Blade. Blade became one of Wesley Snipes' signature roles. His performance established a version of the character that audiences could immediately recognize: quiet, intimidating, athletic, stylish, and relentless. Snipes brought credibility to the physical side of the role. Some vampires appear sophisticated and wealthy. Others are more openly violent. Their world contains internal divisions, and not every vampire agrees about the future of their species. This is especially important because it allows the story to create conflicts within the vampire community itself. Instead of making every vampire identical, the film shows different personalities and ambitions. Some want survival. Some want power. Some want to escape their limitations. And some are willing to do almost anything to change the balance between vampires and humans. This hidden society is one of the movie's most effective world-building ideas because it makes the supernatural threat feel much larger than Blade's individual battles. Deacon Frost, a villain with ambition. Stephen Dorff plays Deacon Frost, one of the film's most important characters. Frost is not satisfied with simply being another member of vampire society. He wants power, recognition, and a new order. His ambition makes him particularly dangerous. Rather than respecting the existing vampire hierarchy, Frost challenges it. He believes that the old rules should not control his future. This creates a conflict between traditional vampire leadership and his more radical vision. Frost's personality is also very different from Blade's. Blade is disciplined and focused. Frost is ambitious, rebellious, and unpredictable. Both characters possess confidence, but they use it in completely different ways. Blade uses his abilities to destroy the vampire threat, while Frost wants to use supernatural power to transform himself and rise above everyone else. This creates a strong hero versus villain dynamic. The conflict becomes more than physical. It is also a battle between two competing ideas about power. Blade believes power should be used to protect humanity. Frost believes power should belong to whoever is strong enough to seize it. The ancient mythology behind the conflict. As the story develops, the movie introduces deeper vampire mythology. Frost discovers information connected to an ancient vampire figure and begins pursuing a supernatural transformation that could dramatically alter the balance between vampires and humans. This gives the story a larger sense of scale. At first, Blade appears to be fighting individual vampires. Then he discovers that something much bigger is happening. The vampire threat is connected to ancient legends, rituals, and ambitions that could have consequences far beyond a single city. This escalation is important to the movie's structure. The audience begins with street-level vampire hunting and gradually discovers that the conflict is connected to an enormous supernatural plan. Blade therefore has to move from fighting individual enemies to preventing an event that could change the entire world. Whistler, Blade's mentor and partner. Kris Kristofferson plays Abraham Whistler, one of the most important people in Blade's life. Whistler is not simply a side character. He is a mentor, weapons expert, and trusted companion. Their relationship gives Blade something the character rarely shows with other people: trust. Whistler understands Blade's mission and has helped prepare him for the vampire war. He provides equipment, knowledge, strategy, and emotional support. Their partnership also creates an interesting balance. Blade represents physical power and relentless determination. Whistler represents experience and preparation. Together, they form an effective vampire hunting team. Whistler also reminds the audience that Blade's battle is not something he can win through strength alone. The vampires are organized, intelligent, and technologically capable. Fighting them requires planning. Their relationship becomes especially meaningful because Blade's isolated personality makes his connection with Whistler stand out. Karen Jensen and the human perspective. Nabushe Wright plays Dr. Karen Jensen, a hematologist who becomes connected to Blade's world after a violent encounter with vampires. Karen provides an important human perspective. Before becoming involved with Blade, she does not understand the supernatural world around her. Her experience allows the audience to discover parts of the vampire mythology through someone who is seeing it for the first time. Her scientific background is also important. While Blade understands vampires through experience, Karen approaches the problem through medicine and biology. This combination of science and supernatural mythology helps create one of the movie's distinctive characteristics. The film does not treat the vampire threat purely as fantasy. It also introduces scientific concepts and medical explanations, giving the supernatural story a modern atmosphere. Karen therefore becomes more than someone Blade must protect. Her knowledge can potentially help him understand his own condition and the biology of his enemies. The science behind the supernatural. One of the most interesting aspects of Blade is the way it mixes supernatural mythology with scientific ideas. The vampires have biological characteristics. Their weaknesses and abilities are treated as things that can potentially be studied. Karen's scientific expertise provides a bridge between Blade's world and the normal human world. This combination was particularly effective because it helped Blade feel different from traditional vampire movies. Instead of relying exclusively on Gothic castles, ancient villages, or historical settings, the film places vampire mythology inside a modern urban environment. Laboratories, nightclubs, warehouses, vehicles, weapons, and technology become part of the supernatural landscape. The result is a vampire story that feels contemporary rather than purely historical. Blade's weapons and fighting style. Blade's equipment is another major part of his identity. His arsenal reflects his knowledge of vampire weaknesses. He does not simply walk into battle and hope his enhanced strength will be enough. He prepares. He uses specialized weapons designed for vampire hunting, along with martial arts and tactical combat. This makes his action scenes feel purposeful. Blade's combat style is a mixture of hand-to-hand fighting, weapons training, agility, and supernatural strength. The choreography helps establish him as someone who has spent years mastering his craft. The weapons also reinforce the idea that Blade has made vampire hunting into a profession. For him, this is not an occasional adventure. It is his life. The movie's dark tone. When Blade was released, its darker tone helped separate it from many other superhero films. The movie embraces violence, horror imagery, supernatural creatures, and a serious atmosphere. It does not attempt to make Blade a cheerful or traditional superhero. The darkness serves a purpose. Blade's world is dangerous. The vampires are predators. The protagonist has experienced trauma. And the stakes are frequently life or death. This tone helps create a sense of urgency throughout the film. The movie also uses darkness visually. Nighttime environments, industrial locations, underground spaces, and dimly lit interiors create an atmosphere that feels appropriate for a story about creatures that hide from daylight. The visual style contributes heavily to the movie's identity, the famous Blood Club sequence. One of the film's most memorable sequences takes place inside a vampire nightclub. At first, the location appears to be a normal place of entertainment. But Blade knows what it really is, a gathering place for vampires. The scene builds tension by allowing the audience to understand that Blade has entered enemy territory. Then everything erupts. The sequence demonstrates the movie's ability to combine music, atmosphere, choreography, special effects, and action. It is also a perfect introduction to the hidden vampire society because the vampires are not hiding in an isolated castle. They are living openly among people, disguised by modern nightlife. Blade's arrival turns the club into a battlefield. The sequence remains one of the strongest examples of the movie's energetic visual style. Blade's personal motivation. Although the movie contains plenty of action, Blade's motivation is deeply personal. He has dedicated his life to fighting vampires because he understands the destruction they cause. This is important because it prevents the character from feeling like a hero who simply happens to have superpowers. Blade has a reason to fight. His abilities come with consequences, and his life is defined by the conflict between his humanity and the vampire world. This gives his character a tragic quality. The more successful Blade becomes at hunting vampires, the more isolated his life becomes. He cannot simply return to normal society. His mission has consumed him. Yet he continues because stopping the vampires is more important to him than having an ordinary life. The transformation of the threat. As Frost's plan develops, the danger becomes increasingly serious. The story shifts from individual vampire attacks to a larger supernatural threat. Blade realizes that Frost is not simply another enemy. He is attempting to achieve something that could fundamentally change the relationship between humans and vampires. This raises the stakes. If Blade fails, the consequences could extend far beyond his personal life. The final act therefore becomes a race against time. Blade must confront increasingly powerful enemies while also dealing with the consequences of his own condition. The film builds toward a confrontation in which Blade's physical abilities, experience, determination, and knowledge of vampire weaknesses all become essential. The final confrontation. The climactic confrontation between Blade and Frost provides the payoff for the entire story. Everything the movie has established comes together: Blade's hatred of vampires, Frost's ambition, ancient mythology, supernatural power, and the question of what happens when someone attempts to transcend the boundaries of their species. The confrontation is not simply about defeating a villain. It represents Blade's rejection of the vampire world. Frost wants to embrace power. Blade wants to destroy the system that created him. Their conflict therefore reflects the movie's central theme of identity. Who has the right to define Blade? The vampires? Human society? Or Blade himself? His answer is revealed through his actions. Why Blade felt different in 1998. One of the biggest achievements of Blade is that it did not feel like a conventional superhero movie. It was a superhero story disguised as a vampire action film. That combination allowed it to reach audiences who might not normally seek out comic book adaptations. The film offered martial arts. It offered horror. It offered supernatural mythology. It offered science fiction elements. And it offered a powerful central character. This genre mixture gave Blade its own personality. Rather than trying to imitate traditional superhero storytelling, the movie created its own world. That was a major reason it stood out. Commercial success. Blade was made with a reported budget of approximately $45 million and ultimately earned around $131 million worldwide. That commercial performance was significant. The movie demonstrated that a Marvel character could lead a successful theatrical action film even without the mainstream recognition enjoyed by characters such as Batman or Superman. Its success also helped establish confidence in Marvel-based filmmaking. At the time, audiences did not know that superhero movies would eventually dominate Hollywood. But Blade became one of the important films showing that comic book adaptations could work when filmmakers treated the material seriously. A major moment for Marvel. It is difficult to discuss the history of Marvel movies without recognizing the importance of Blade. The film arrived years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There was no interconnected MCU storyline. There were no post-credit scenes designed to tease dozens of future films. There was no established Marvel Studios formula. Instead, Blade had to succeed on its own. And it did. Its success demonstrated that comic book characters could be adapted into mature, visually distinctive action films. That achievement helped create a path for future Marvel adaptations. The movie's influence is therefore larger than its individual box office performance. The legacy of Wesley Snipes' Blade. Blade became one of Wesley Snipes' signature roles. His performance established a version of the character that audiences could immediately recognize: quiet, intimidating, athletic, stylish, and relentless. Snipes brought credibility to the physical side of the role. His martial arts background and screen presence allowed the character to feel like a genuine action hero rather than simply a comic book character wearing a costume. The sunglasses, black clothing, sword, and distinctive attitude all contributed to the character's iconic image. But the costume was never the most important part. The character's personality made the image memorable. Blade looked like someone who belonged in his world. The beginning of a franchise. The success of Blade eventually led to 2 sequels. Blade 2 followed in 2002, while Blade: Trinity arrived in 2004. The franchise expanded the character's world and introduced new conflicts and enemies. But the 1998 film remains the foundation. It established Blade's mythology, his relationship with Whistler, his conflict with vampires, and the overall tone of the series. Without the original movie's success, the later films might never have existed. Blade's return to the screen. Years later, Wesley Snipes returned to the character in Deadpool and Wolverine in 2024. That appearance demonstrated how strongly audiences continued to associate Snipes with Blade. More than 2 decades after the original film, the character still carried nostalgic and cultural significance. For many viewers, Snipes remains one of the defining faces of Blade. That longevity says a great deal about the impact of the 1998 movie. Why Blade still matters. Looking back, Blade can be appreciated not only as an entertaining vampire action movie but also as an important chapter in superhero cinema. It arrived before the modern superhero boom. It did not have the enormous cinematic universe surrounding today's comic book blockbusters. It did not depend on dozens of interconnected characters. Instead, it built its identity around one unusual hero and one dangerous supernatural world. That simplicity helped the film. Blade had one clear mission: hunt vampires. The story surrounding him gave that mission increasing complexity, but the central idea remained easy to understand. The movie also understood the importance of style. From the costumes and weapons to the dark environments and energetic action sequences, Blade created a recognizable visual identity. Final analysis. Ultimately, Blade is significant because it proved that a Marvel character could succeed in a dark, adult-oriented action movie long before superhero films became Hollywood's biggest franchise category. Stephen Norrington's direction gave the film a distinctive visual personality, while David S. Goya's screenplay created a world where vampire mythology, science, action, and superhero storytelling could exist together. Wesley Snipes became the heart of the movie. His Blade is not a traditional hero. He is isolated, determined, dangerous, and deeply connected to the supernatural enemies he hunts. His greatest strength is also part of his personal struggle. He belongs partly to the world he has sworn to destroy. The supporting performances from Dorff, Kris Kristofferson, and Nebushe Wright help expand the story beyond Blade himself. Frost gives the movie a villain driven by ambition, Whistler provides Blade with experience and emotional connection, and Karen offers a scientific perspective on the strange world she suddenly discovers. The result is a superhero film that does not look or feel like the superhero movies that would dominate the following decades. It is a vampire movie. It is an action movie. It is a supernatural thriller. It is a comic book adaptation. And, at its core, it is the story of an outsider who has turned his unusual existence into a weapon against the darkness. That combination is what made Blade stand out in 1998. Its commercial success proved that audiences were ready for something different. Its dark tone helped separate it from more conventional comic book adaptations, and its legacy became increasingly apparent as superhero cinema grew into one of Hollywood's most influential genres. More than 2 decades later, Blade remains an important milestone. It showed that a comic book movie did not need to follow a single formula. It could be dark. It could be violent. It could be stylish. It could blend genres. And it could build an entire cinematic experience around a character who existed between 2 worlds. For Marvel's history on the big screen, that achievement is difficult to overlook. Blade may have begun as the story of one vampire hunter, but its influence reached much further. It helped demonstrate the theatrical potential of Marvel characters and gave audiences one of the most distinctive comic book action heroes of the late 1990s. The story of Blade begins with a tragedy that takes place long before the vampire hunter becomes a legend. In 1967, a pregnant woman is attacked by a vampire, and the horrifying encounter sends her into premature labor. Doctors manage to save her newborn child, but the mother does not survive. That child grows up to become Blade. 30 years later, the boy born from that tragic event has become one of the most feared enemies of the vampire world. But Blade is not an ordinary human, and he is not a traditional vampire either. He exists somewhere between both worlds. The vampires call him the Daywalker. He possesses many of their extraordinary abilities, including enhanced strength, speed, reflexes, stamina, and healing. Yet unlike ordinary vampires, he is not destroyed by sunlight. He can walk through the day, enter places where vampires cannot survive, and hunt them when they least expect it. But Blade's existence comes with a terrible price. Although he does not suffer from the traditional weaknesses of vampires, his body still carries one dangerous need, the desire for human blood. Throughout his life, Blade has fought against that urge because he refuses to become the very creature he has dedicated himself to destroying. This internal struggle makes his mission far more complicated than simply hunting monsters. Blade is fighting vampires on the outside while fighting his own nature on the inside. And as the story unfolds, he discovers that the vampire world is preparing something far more dangerous than another attack on humanity. A powerful vampire named Deacon Frost wants to awaken an ancient blood deity known as La Magra. And Blade's blood may be the key.
It is becoming less effective. Blade has used it repeatedly, and his body is beginning to resist it. That means the solution he has depended on for years may soon stop working. Blade is running out of time. The danger is not only external. His own biology is becoming a ticking clock. Karen's scientific investigation. Karen's medical background now becomes extremely important. She begins investigating the unusual biological properties associated with vampires. Instead of treating the vampire infection as purely supernatural, she approaches it scientifically. She studies blood. She examines the effects of the condition. And eventually, she experiments with EDTA, an anticoagulant. The discovery becomes one of the film's most important scientific moments. Karen finds that EDTA reacts violently when combined with vampire blood. The result is explosive. This discovery gives her a potential weapon against the vampires. But it also suggests something even more valuable. If she can understand how vampire blood reacts, perhaps she can develop a treatment. The possibility of a cure. Karen manages to synthesize a vaccine capable of curing people affected by the vampire infection. For the first time, the possibility of reversing the condition becomes real. This changes Karen's role in the story. She is no longer simply someone Blade is protecting. She has become an important part of the fight. Her scientific knowledge may provide humanity with something Blade has never had before, a way to reverse the vampire condition. But there is a heartbreaking complication. The vaccine will not work on Blade. His biology is different. He is not simply an infected human. He is a hybrid. His condition is part of who he is. Karen believes she may eventually be able to develop a treatment for Blade's bloodlust, but doing so would require years of research. Blade does not have years. The vampire threat is growing. Frost is preparing his ritual. And Blade's serum is failing. Everything is moving toward a final confrontation. Blade's greatest internal battle. This part of the story reveals why Blade is such a compelling hero. He is not simply fighting for humanity. He is fighting for himself. Every day, Blade has to resist the urge to drink blood. Every battle consumes energy. Every injury pushes his body closer to its limits. Every vampire he kills reminds him of the nature he is trying to reject. Blade wants to remain human, even though his body tells him he is something else. This makes his fight against Frost deeply personal. Frost embraces the supernatural side of himself. Blade rejects it. Frost wants to become more powerful. Blade wants to maintain control. Frost sees his unusual nature as an opportunity. Blade sees his own nature as a burden that must be controlled. Their opposing attitudes create a powerful contrast. The growing sense of urgency. By this point, several storylines are moving toward the same destination. Frost has seized control of the vampire leadership. The ancient vampire ritual has been discovered. Blade's blood has been identified as a key ingredient. Karen has discovered a potential treatment for vampire infection. Blade's serum is losing effectiveness. And the vampire world is preparing for a transformation. The story therefore becomes increasingly urgent. Blade cannot simply continue hunting vampires one at a time. He must confront the larger conspiracy. He has to prevent Frost from completing the ritual. And he must protect Karen because her scientific discoveries could become extremely important to humanity's survival. A hero who lives in the shadows. One of the strongest ideas in Blade is that the hero protects a world that does not know he exists. Ordinary people continue living their lives without realizing that vampires are operating around them. Blade cannot reveal himself to everyone. He cannot expect praise. He cannot expect recognition. He fights because someone has to. That makes his heroism different from the traditional superhero model. There are no cheering crowds waiting for Blade. There is no public celebration. There is only another night, another vampire, another fight. Blade accepts this because his mission has become his purpose. Why this story works? The storyline succeeds because it combines several different conflicts. There is the physical conflict between Blade and the vampires. There is the political conflict between Frost and the pureblood elders. There is the scientific conflict surrounding Karen's research. And there is the personal conflict inside Blade himself. Each storyline connects to the others. Blade's blood is important because he is a hybrid. Frost needs his blood because he wants to awaken La Magra. Karen studies vampire blood because she wants to find a cure. Blade needs the serum because he is struggling against his own bloodlust. Everything comes back to blood. In Blade, blood is not simply a horror element. It represents identity, power, survival, transformation, and control. Final thoughts on this chapter of Blade's story. The early and middle portions of Blade establish far more than a simple battle between a hero and monsters. They build an entire hidden world. Blade is introduced as the Daywalker, a unique human-vampire hybrid who has turned his unusual nature into a weapon. Whistler reveals the existence of a secret war that has been taking place beneath ordinary society. Karen becomes the audience's gateway into this hidden world, moving from scientific certainty into a reality where vampires genuinely exist. Frost emerges as a dangerous revolutionary who refuses to accept the traditional vampire hierarchy. The vampire elders represent an old order that believes it can control the future. Frost represents a new and more aggressive vision. Meanwhile, Blade discovers that his own blood is connected to an ancient supernatural ritual involving La Magra. The situation becomes even more dangerous when his serum begins losing its effectiveness. For Blade, there is no easy escape. He cannot simply stop hunting. He cannot surrender to his bloodlust. And he cannot allow Frost to use his blood to achieve unimaginable power. Karen's discovery of a potential vaccine provides a small ray of hope, but even that hope has limits. The treatment may work for infected humans, but Blade's unique biology places him beyond the reach of the simple cure. That makes his situation especially tragic. He may be the most powerful person in the fight against the vampires, but he is also one of the characters most deeply affected by the vampire condition. Blade's greatest weapon is the very thing he fears becoming. And that contradiction sits at the heart of his character. As the story moves toward its final confrontation, the audience understands that Blade is not simply fighting to defeat one villain. He is fighting to protect humanity, prevent an ancient supernatural power from being unleashed, and preserve the last remaining part of himself that he considers human. That combination of action, horror, science, mythology, and personal struggle is what gives Blade its distinctive identity. The movie's world is dangerous because the vampires are not simply monsters hiding in the darkness. They are organized. They have history. They have politics. They have servants. They have technology. And they have ambitions. But Blade knows their weaknesses. He knows how they think. He knows how they fight. And most importantly, he refuses to become one of them. The Daywalker has spent his entire life walking between two worlds. Now those worlds are about to collide. The final act of Blade takes everything the movie has established: the secret vampire society, Blade's struggle with his own bloodlust, Deacon Frost's ambition, Karen's scientific discoveries, and the ancient legend of La Maigre, and brings all of those elements crashing together. What begins as a conflict between a vampire hunter and a dangerous vampire gradually becomes something much larger. Frost is no longer satisfied with controlling a faction of vampires. He wants to overthrow the old order and obtain supernatural power beyond anything an ordinary vampire possesses. Blade stands directly in his way. But before the final battle can begin, Blade is forced to experience one of the most painful moments of his life. His trusted friend Whistler is attacked, Karen is kidnapped, and Blade discovers a devastating secret about his own past. The enemy he has spent years fighting is connected directly to the tragedy that created him. And suddenly, the vampire war becomes deeply personal. Blade rejects Frost's offer. At this point in the story, Deacon Frost attempts to offer Blade a truce. It may sound surprising that Frost would approach the man who has spent years hunting vampires. But Frost understands that Blade is different. Blade is the Daywalker. His blood is essential to Frost's ritual. Instead of simply killing Blade, Frost tries to manipulate him. The offer is essentially an attempt to convince Blade that they might have something in common. Both are outsiders in their respective worlds. Both possess abilities that separate them from ordinary beings. Both reject the established order in different ways. But Blade has no interest in joining Frost. For Blade, there is no compromise. Frost represents everything he has spent his life fighting against. He represents the vampire world that destroyed his family and turned his existence into a never-ending battle. Blade refuses the truce. And Frost responds exactly as expected. He attacks. The attack on the hideout. Frost and his followers launch an assault on Blade's hideout. This is not simply another vampire attack. The hideout represents one of the few places where Blade and Whistler feel safe. It contains their weapons, equipment, medical supplies, and everything they have built during years of vampire hunting. Frost's attack destroys that sense of security. The vampires break through the defenses and overwhelm the location. Whistler attempts to fight back, but the situation becomes increasingly desperate. The attack demonstrates one of Frost's greatest strengths. He does not fight according to old vampire traditions. He uses overwhelming force. He attacks when his enemies are vulnerable. And he understands that hurting Blade emotionally can be just as effective as defeating him physically. During the assault, Whistler is bitten. For someone who has spent his entire life fighting vampires, the possibility of becoming one of them is horrifying. Karen is also captured. Blade is left with a terrible situation. His friend is infected. The woman he has been trying to protect has been kidnapped. And Frost has gained another advantage. Blade returns to the ruined hideout. When Blade returns, he discovers what has happened. The hideout has been attacked. Karen is gone. Whistler has been bitten. The situation is devastating. But the most painful moment comes when Blade realizes that Whistler does not want to become a vampire. Whistler has spent his entire life fighting these creatures. He understands what the transformation would mean. For him, becoming a vampire would represent the ultimate defeat. Blade therefore faces an unbearable decision. He cannot save Whistler from the infection, but he can prevent him from becoming what they have spent their lives destroying. Whistler's final choice. Blade helps Whistler end his own life before the vampire infection can fully take control. The moment is one of the film's most emotional scenes because Blade is usually presented as almost unstoppable. He can fight armies of vampires. He can survive incredible injuries. He can walk into places that would terrify ordinary people. But none of that power can save Whistler. The scene reminds the audience that Blade's mission has a devastating human cost. Every victory against the vampires comes with the possibility of losing someone. Whistler was more than Blade's partner. He was his mentor. He was one of the few people Blade trusted completely. And now Blade has to continue the mission without him. This loss makes the coming confrontation with Frost even more personal. Blade is no longer fighting only because it is his duty. He is fighting because Frost has taken almost everything from him. And Blade is determined to take them back. But when he reaches Frost's penthouse, he discovers something he never expected. Someone from his past is waiting for him. His mother. The shocking revelation. Vanessa Brooks. Blade discovers that his mother, Vanessa Brooks, is still alive. For years, Blade believed that his mother died on the night of the attack that led to his birth. But the truth is far more complicated. Vanessa reveals that she survived the original attack. After she was bitten, she returned to the vampire world. She was eventually brought under Frost's influence. The revelation is devastating because Blade's entire life has been shaped by the belief that his mother was a victim. Now he discovers that she has become part of the world he hates. Even worse, Frost reveals the truth about himself. He was the vampire who originally attacked Vanessa. The tragedy that created Blade was connected to Frost from the beginning. Blade's real name, Eric Brooks. The movie also reveals Blade's birth name. He is Eric Brooks. The name is significant because it reminds the audience that Blade was once simply a child. Before the weapons. Before the sunglasses. Before the vampire hunts. Before the Daywalker became a legend. There was Eric Brooks. A child whose life was changed by a vampire attack before he even had the opportunity to understand what had happened. Over the years, the name Blade became his identity. It represents the warrior he created from his trauma. But beneath that identity is still Eric, the son of Vanessa Brooks. This revelation gives the final confrontation a much more personal dimension. Blade is not simply fighting Frost, the vampire responsible for countless crimes. He is confronting the creature connected to the destruction of his family. Frost's greatest manipulation. Frost has always understood how to use people. He uses human familiars. He manipulates vampire factions. He challenges the elders. And now he uses Blade's mother as another weapon. Vanessa's presence is designed to destabilize Blade emotionally. The vampire hunter has spent his entire life believing that his past was simple. His mother was attacked. She died. He became the Daywalker. Now that story has been shattered. The truth is much darker. His mother survived. She became a vampire. And Frost was responsible for the attack. For Blade, the revelation is almost too much to process. But Frost does not give him time. Blade is subdued. His enemy has finally captured the Daywalker. The Temple of Eternal Night. Frost takes Blade to the Temple of Eternal Night. This is where the final ritual will take place. The temple represents everything Frost has been pursuing. Ancient vampire mythology, power, blood, transformation, and the awakening of La Maigre. Blade is no longer simply a prisoner. He is the key ingredient. His blood is needed to complete the ritual. The ancient prophecy and Frost's ambition have finally reached the same destination. Blade has spent the entire movie trying to uncover Frost's plan. Now he is physically inside it. Karen faces a horrifying fate. While Blade is being prepared for the ritual, Karen is thrown into a pit. There she encounters Webb, a former colleague who has been transformed into a horrifying vampire-like creature. The transformation is disturbing because Webb was once human. Now he has become something barely recognizable. His body is deteriorating. His appearance is grotesque. And his humanity appears to have disappeared. Karen is expected to become his victim. But Karen refuses to surrender. She fights back. Despite being terrified and physically outmatched, she manages to injure Webb and escape. This moment is important because Karen has changed dramatically since the beginning of the movie. At first, she was a scientist who had no understanding of vampires. Now she is fighting supernatural creatures and surviving situations that would have been unimaginable to her. She has become an active participant in the war. Blade is drained. At the temple, Frost begins the ritual. Blade is restrained. His blood is drained. The Daywalker's greatest strength becomes the weapon being used against him. Blade has spent his life hunting vampires because of what their world did to him. Now the vampire leader is using Blade's own blood to create something even more powerful. Blade's physical condition rapidly deteriorates. For the first time, the unstoppable hunter appears helpless. But Karen is still nearby. And she realizes there may be a way to save him. Karen gives Blade her blood. Karen allows Blade to drink her blood. This is a remarkable moment because Blade has spent the entire story trying to resist his need for human blood. The serum has helped him control the craving. He has refused to become a predator. But now his survival depends on blood. Karen makes the decision willingly. She understands that Blade needs it to recover. The moment is not about Blade surrendering to his vampire nature. It is about survival. Karen's blood gives him enough strength to recover and continue the fight. The decision also demonstrates the trust that has developed between them. Earlier, Karen was simply a doctor caught in a supernatural nightmare. Now she understands Blade's mission and is willing to risk herself to help him. Frost completes the ritual. While Blade recovers, Frost successfully completes the ritual. The transformation is the culmination of his ambition. He has spent the entire movie rejecting the idea that he is inferior to pureblood vampires. Now he obtains the power of La Maigre. Frost has effectively transcended the ordinary limitations of his species. The man who once wanted respect has now gained supernatural power on an entirely different level. For a moment, it appears that Blade has lost. Frost has the power. The elders are defeated. Blade is weakened. The ritual is complete. But Frost makes one critical mistake. He believes that physical power makes him invincible. Blade knows better. The final fight begins. Blade emerges to confront Frost. But Frost is no longer the same enemy he was earlier. The ritual has changed him. He possesses tremendous power. Blade attacks anyway. The fight becomes a brutal confrontation between two beings with extraordinary abilities. Frost's new power makes him incredibly difficult to hurt. Blade is fast. He is skilled. He is experienced. But Frost appears to have the advantage. This is one of the most important moments in the story because Blade cannot win by simply overpowering Frost. He needs another strategy. Blade eliminates Frost's followers. Before facing Frost directly, Blade fights through his remaining enemies. One by one, Frost's followers are eliminated. Blade has spent the entire movie learning about Frost's organization. Now he dismantles it. The vampires who helped Frost rise to power become obstacles that Blade must overcome. His determination is stronger than ever. Every enemy he defeats brings him closer to the final confrontation. But one enemy remains especially painful. His mother. Blade confronts Vanessa. Blade confronts Vanessa Brooks. This is one of the most emotionally complicated battles in the movie. Vanessa is not simply another vampire. She is Blade's mother. The person whose death shaped his childhood. The person whose memory has remained part of his identity. Now she stands against him. Frost has turned Blade's family history into another weapon. Blade has no choice but to fight. The confrontation represents the destruction of the last illusion Blade had about his past. His mother survived. But the woman he remembers is gone. Blade defeats her. It is a victory, But it is also a tragedy. The man who has spent his life hunting vampires has been forced to kill the person who gave him life. Frost appears unstoppable. After Blade defeats the other vampires, he finally faces Frost. But the transformed Frost is incredibly powerful. Blade attacks, but Frost's new abilities make him difficult to defeat. The battle demonstrates the consequences of the ritual. Frost has achieved what he wanted. He has become something beyond an ordinary vampire. For a moment, Blade appears to be outmatched. But Blade has never relied solely on brute strength. His greatest advantage has always been his understanding of vampire weaknesses. He looks for a vulnerability, and he finds one. Blade remembers the human body beneath the power. Blade realizes something crucial. No matter how powerful Frost has become, his physical body is still vulnerable. Frost may possess the power of La Maigre, but he still exists in a physical form. That means Blade does not need to defeat the supernatural power directly. He needs to exploit Frost's biology. This is where Karen's earlier scientific discovery becomes essential. EDTA. The substance that reacts violently with vampire blood. Blade understands that he can turn Karen's discovery into a weapon. Instead of trying to overpower Frost, he will make Frost's own body destroy itself. The EDTA trap. Blade uses an enormous dose of EDTA against Frost. It is a desperate gamble. The substance enters Frost's body. For a moment, nothing appears to happen. Then the reaction begins. Frost's body starts changing. The supernatural power inside him becomes unstable. His physical form begins to break down. The terrifying vampire who believed he had become unstoppable suddenly loses control of his own body. This is the perfect ending for Frost's character. His obsession with power becomes the cause of his destruction. He wanted to become more than a vampire. He wanted to become a god. Instead, his own body betrays him. Frost's destruction. The reaction becomes increasingly violent. Frost's body transforms into a grotesque mass before ultimately exploding. The villain who believed he could control everything is destroyed by the very biology he underestimated. Blade wins. But he does not win by becoming stronger than Frost. He wins because he understands his enemy. That distinction is crucial. Blade's greatest weapon is not his supernatural strength. It is his experience. He knows vampires. He knows their weaknesses. And he knows how to adapt. The meaning behind Frost's defeat. Frost's destruction has a symbolic meaning. Throughout the movie, Frost believes that power is everything. He rejects the traditional vampire hierarchy because he believes he deserves more. He manipulates others. He destroys the elders. He sacrifices people. He uses Blade's blood. He awakens La Maigre. Every decision is motivated by his desire for greater power. But in the end, power cannot save him. His arrogance becomes his weakness. Blade, meanwhile, has never wanted unlimited power. He wants control. He wants to remain himself. That contrast explains why Blade defeats Frost. Frost wants to become a god. Blade simply wants to remain human enough to choose his own path. Karen offers Blade a cure. After the battle, Karen offers to help Blade cure his condition. She now understands his biology better than she did before. She knows that Blade suffers from bloodlust. She knows the serum is failing. And she believes that scientific research could eventually provide a solution. For Karen, this is an opportunity to help Blade escape the burden he has carried his entire life. But Blade makes a surprising decision. He does not ask for a complete cure. Instead, he asks Karen to improve his serum. Blade chooses the mission. Blade's decision reveals something important about his character. He does not want to stop being the Daywalker. He wants to continue the crusade. The serum gives him control over his bloodlust. If Karen can improve it, Blade can continue hunting vampires without surrendering to his instincts. This choice tells us that Blade has accepted his identity. He may never have an ordinary life. He may never completely escape his vampire nature. But he can decide what that nature means. His abilities do not define his morality. His choices do. Blade chooses to use his supernatural powers to protect humanity. The Daywalker lives on. The ending does not suggest that Blade's mission is finished. Frost is dead, but the vampire world remains. There are still vampires hiding in cities around the world. There are still threats. There are still people who need protection. And Blade still has work to do. The final moments therefore feel less like the end of a story and more like the beginning of a larger crusade. Blade walks away from the events of the movie knowing that his war is not over. He has lost Whistler. He has confronted his mother. He has defeated Frost. He has survived the ritual. But he still has the bloodlust. He still needs the serum. And he still has enemies. The Moscow epilogue. The brief epilogue reinforces this idea. Blade appears in Moscow, where he confronts another old vampire enemy. The location makes the world of Blade feel larger. His mission is not limited to one city. The vampire threat is international. And Blade is willing to travel wherever the enemy appears. The ending therefore reinforces his identity as a global vampire hunter. The war continues. Blade's real victory. Blade's greatest victory is not simply defeating Frost. It is maintaining control over himself. Throughout the movie, Blade has constantly faced the possibility of losing his humanity. He needs blood. He possesses vampire abilities. His enemies see him as part of their world. Frost even attempts to use his blood to unlock supernatural power. But Blade refuses to let his biology determine his morality. That is what makes him a hero. He is not heroic because he is completely human. He is heroic because he chooses to protect humans despite being something different. The importance of Karen's role. Karen also undergoes a major transformation. She begins the story as a scientist who knows nothing about vampires. By the end, she has become one of Blade's most important allies. She discovers the explosive reaction involving EDTA. She develops a vaccine. She helps Blade survive. She confronts a monstrous creature. She escapes from Frost's trap. And she offers Blade hope for the future. Her scientific knowledge becomes the perfect complement to Blade's combat abilities. Blade understands the battlefield. Karen understands the biology. Together, they represent two different approaches to the same war. The emotional cost of victory. Despite defeating Frost, Blade's victory is not completely joyful. Whistler is gone. His mother is dead. His body still needs the serum. The vampire threat continues. And Blade remains isolated. This makes the ending more mature. The hero wins, but the victory does not magically repair everything. Blade cannot bring Whistler back. He cannot erase his childhood trauma. He cannot completely change his biology. He can only continue forward. That is what makes his final decision so powerful. He accepts the burden. Why the final act works. The final act succeeds because every major element introduced earlier becomes important. Whistler's relationship with Blade makes his death meaningful. Karen's scientific research becomes the key to defeating Frost. Blade's blood becomes essential to the ritual. Frost's ambition leads him to La Magra. Vanessa connects the villain to Blade's personal history. And Blade's bloodlust becomes part of the final decision about his future. Nothing feels completely disconnected. The story brings its major ideas together during the climax. The final meaning of Blade. At its heart, Blade is a story about identity. Blade was born from violence. He grew up between two worlds. He possesses the abilities of a vampire but rejects their lifestyle. He is feared by the creatures he hunts. He is separated from ordinary humans. Yet he continues choosing humanity. That is the defining characteristic of the Daywalker. He is not controlled by his blood. He controls what he does with it. Frost represents the opposite philosophy. Frost believes that identity should be determined by power. If he can become powerful enough, he believes he can become whatever he wants. Blade believes that identity comes from choice. That philosophical difference is ultimately what separates the hero from the villain. Final conclusion. The final portion of Blade transforms the movie from a straightforward vampire action story into a powerful character-driven conclusion. Blade rejects Frost's offer of a truce, forcing the conflict into its final stage. Frost retaliates by attacking the hideout, biting Whistler, and kidnapping Karen. Blade returns to find his closest ally facing a fate he cannot accept, and he helps Whistler avoid becoming a vampire. Then comes the revelation that changes everything. Blade discovers that his mother survived the original attack. Her name is Vanessa Brooks, and the vampire responsible for attacking her was Deacon Frost. Blade's real name, Eric Brooks, reminds us that beneath the legendary vampire hunter is still the child whose life was changed by that night. Frost then takes Blade to the Temple of Eternal Night and uses his blood to complete the ritual for La Magra. Karen, meanwhile, survives her own horrifying ordeal and manages to escape. When Blade is nearly drained of his blood, Karen gives him hers, allowing him to recover. Frost completes the ritual and becomes incredibly powerful. But Blade refuses to give up. He fights through Frost's followers, confronts his mother, and finally faces the transformed Frost. At first, Frost appears unbeatable. But Blade realizes that supernatural power does not make the physical body invulnerable. Using Karen's discovery about EDTA, Blade turns Frost's own biology against him. The result is catastrophic. Frost's transformed body breaks down and explodes. The vampire who wanted to become a god is destroyed by the limits of his own physical existence. Afterward, Karen offers Blade the possibility of a cure. But Blade makes another defining choice. He does not ask her to remove his supernatural nature. Instead, he asks her to improve the serum that controls his bloodlust. He wants to continue the fight. He wants to remain the Daywalker. And in the closing moments, Blade's journey continues beyond the city, as he confronts another vampire enemy in Moscow. The message is clear. Frost may be dead. The ritual may be over. But the war is not finished. Blade's life will never be normal. He will always exist between two worlds. He will always have to control the hunger inside him. But he has discovered something more important than a cure. He has discovered that his nature does not decide who he becomes. One of the biggest strengths of Blade is its characters. The movie may be packed with vampire battles, martial arts, supernatural mythology, weapons, and dark action, but the story becomes memorable because of the people standing at the center of that conflict. At the heart of everything is Eric Brooks, better known as Blade, a half-vampire warrior who has turned his unusual nature into a weapon against the vampire world. Around him are a group of characters who each represent a different part of the movie's universe. There is Abraham Whistler, the mentor and father figure who helps Blade prepare for his endless war. There is Dr. Karen Jensen, a scientist who begins as an outsider but gradually becomes an important ally. There is Deacon Frost, an ambitious vampire who refuses to accept his position in vampire society and dreams of obtaining unimaginable power. And there are characters such as Quinn and Gaetano Dragonetti, who help demonstrate the different levels of power, tradition, and ambition within the vampire world. Together, these characters create the foundation of Blade and help turn the movie from a simple vampire hunting adventure into a story about identity, loyalty, ambition, survival, and the battle between humanity and supernatural power. Wesley Snipes as Eric Brooks' Blade. Wesley Snipes plays the central character, Eric Brooks, who is known throughout the movie as Blade. Blade is a unique figure in the vampire world. He is not completely human. He is not completely vampire. He exists between both worlds. Because of his unusual biology, Blade possesses many of the supernatural abilities associated with vampires while remaining capable of moving through daylight. This is why he earns the nickname Daywalker. His hybrid nature gives him extraordinary physical abilities. He is stronger and faster than ordinary humans. His reflexes are highly developed. He can survive injuries that would be devastating to an ordinary person. He is also an expert martial artist and an experienced weapons user. But Blade's powers are only one part of what makes him dangerous. His greatest advantage is experience. He has spent years studying vampires. He knows how they behave. He knows how they fight. He understands their weaknesses. And he has developed specialized weapons specifically for killing them. Blade does not enter a fight without preparation. He carries equipment designed around vampire vulnerabilities, including weapons connected to sunlight, silver, and other traditional weaknesses. This makes him feel less like a superhero who suddenly discovers his powers and more like a highly trained supernatural soldier. Blade as an outsider. Blade's greatest character trait may actually be his isolation. He does not fully belong to the human world. But he has rejected the vampire world. This creates a permanent identity conflict. The vampires see him as something unnatural. Humans who discover what he is might also fear him. Blade therefore lives in a strange space between two societies. He has no interest in becoming part of the vampire community. In fact, he has dedicated his life to destroying it. This makes his existence almost tragic. The abilities that make him powerful are connected to the creatures he hates. He is forced to use the very nature he rejects. That contradiction is at the center of the character. Blade's life can be viewed as an ongoing struggle between biology and choice. His body may contain vampire characteristics, but his actions are determined by his moral decisions. He chooses to protect humans. He chooses to fight vampires. He chooses not to surrender to his bloodlust. That is what separates him from his enemies. The Daywalker's bloodlust. Blade's condition also creates a major personal weakness. Although he can survive daylight and avoid many traditional vampire weaknesses, he still experiences a craving for blood. This hunger is something he constantly has to control. It is one of the most important reminders that Blade is not entirely human. He uses a serum to suppress his bloodlust, allowing him to continue functioning without becoming dependent on human blood. But the serum is not a permanent solution. Its effectiveness begins to decline. This creates an additional danger for Blade. He is fighting vampires on the outside while fighting his own biology on the inside. That makes him a more complicated protagonist. If Blade were simply a powerful warrior with no weaknesses, the character would be less interesting. Instead, the movie gives him a constant internal struggle. Every victory carries the question of whether he can maintain control. Wesley Snipes' performance. Wesley Snipes gives Blade a quiet intensity. The character does not need long speeches to establish his authority. His body language does much of the work. Blade often appears calm even when surrounded by enemies. He moves with confidence. He speaks with purpose. And he rarely wastes energy. This creates the impression of a man who has been fighting for a very long time. Snipes also brings his action background to the character. The physicality of the performance makes Blade convincing as a supernatural warrior. His fighting style combines martial arts, weapons, speed, and strength. The result is a hero who feels physically different from many comic book protagonists of the period. Blade does not depend on elaborate technology alone. He is the weapon. Everything else simply helps him use that weapon more effectively. Stephen Dorff as Deacon Frost. Opposite Blade is Stephen Dorff as Deacon Frost. Frost is the primary antagonist of the movie and one of the most important characters in the vampire world. What makes Frost interesting is that he is not satisfied with the position he has been given. The traditional vampire hierarchy considers him inferior because he is not a pureblood vampire. Instead of accepting that status, Frost becomes obsessed with gaining power. He wants to prove that his origins do not determine his future. This ambition becomes dangerous. Frost does not simply want to survive. He wants to rule. He wants to change the balance between vampires and humans. And eventually, he seeks supernatural power far beyond the ordinary vampire condition. Frost as a rebellious vampire. Frost represents rebellion against the established vampire order. The pureblood elders believe they should control vampire society. They consider themselves superior to vampires who were created rather than born into the species. Frost rejects that hierarchy. To him, the elders are old, weak, and unwilling to embrace change. He believes that power should belong to those willing to seize it. This philosophy makes Frost dangerous even before he gains supernatural power. He is willing to challenge tradition. He is willing to manipulate others. He is willing to kill his own allies. And he is prepared to start a conflict that could expose the vampire world. His ambition ultimately leads him toward the ancient ritual involving La Magra. At that point, Frost's goals expand beyond personal revenge or social status. He wants to become something greater than an ordinary vampire. Frost's relationship with Blade. The relationship between Frost and Blade is based on opposition. Blade represents control. Frost represents excess. Blade has supernatural power but spends his life trying to control his instincts. Frost seeks more and more power without considering the consequences. Blade wants to protect humanity. Frost wants to dominate it. Blade sees his hybrid nature as a responsibility. Frost sees supernatural power as a path to greatness. This makes them perfect opposites. Both are outsiders in some way. But they make completely different choices about what their differences mean. Blade chooses discipline. Frost chooses ambition. Blade fights to protect. Frost fights to control. Their eventual confrontation therefore feels like more than a physical battle. It is a clash between two completely different philosophies. Kris Kristofferson as Abraham Whistler. Kris Kristofferson plays Abraham Whistler, one of the most important supporting characters in the movie. Whistler is Blade's mentor, father figure, weaponsmith, and trusted partner. He understands the vampire world and has spent years fighting it alongside Blade. Whistler is important because he provides Blade with something the Daywalker rarely has: emotional connection. Blade is naturally isolated. He spends most of his time hunting vampires. He does not easily trust people. But Whistler has earned his trust. Their relationship suggests that Blade's journey was never completely solitary. Whistler helped train him. He helped equip him. He helped him understand the vampire world. And he became something close to family. Whistler as a father figure. The father-son quality of their relationship adds emotional depth to the movie. Whistler does not treat Blade simply as a weapon. He understands the person behind the warrior. He knows Blade's strengths. He knows his weaknesses. He knows about his bloodlust. And he understands the burden Blade carries because of his hybrid nature. This makes Whistler one of the few people capable of reaching Blade emotionally. When Blade is facing danger, Whistler is not simply concerned about whether the mission succeeds. He is concerned about Blade surviving. That relationship makes their partnership believable. Whistler the weaponsmith. Whistler is also essential to the practical side of Blade's mission. He creates and maintains the weapons Blade uses against vampires. These weapons are not ordinary equipment. They are designed around specific supernatural weaknesses. Sunlight becomes a weapon. Silver becomes a weapon. Traditional vampire lore becomes something practical. Whistler essentially turns vampire mythology into military technology. This helps explain why Blade is so effective. He does not simply walk into vampire territory with a sword. He has specialized equipment designed for the enemy. Whistler is the person who makes much of that possible. Nebuchadnezzar Wright as Dr. Karen Jensen. Nebuchadnezzar Wright plays Dr. Karen Jensen, a hematologist whose life changes completely after she is attacked by a vampire. Karen begins the movie as an ordinary medical professional. She has no experience with supernatural creatures. She does not know that vampires exist. She certainly does not expect to become involved in a secret war. Her introduction provides the audience with an important perspective. Through Karen, we see what happens when an ordinary person suddenly discovers the hidden vampire world. At first, she is confused, then frightened, then curious. Eventually, she becomes determined to understand what has happened to her. Karen's scientific perspective. Karen's greatest strength is her scientific knowledge. While Blade understands vampires through years of combat, Karen approaches them through medicine and biology. This difference becomes extremely useful. She begins studying vampire blood and discovers unusual reactions that can potentially be used against them. Her experiments eventually lead to the discovery involving EDTA. She also develops a vaccine that can potentially cure people affected by vampirism. Karen therefore becomes more than a character who needs protection. She becomes an essential member of Blade's team. Her knowledge provides solutions that brute force cannot. Karen's transformation. Karen's character develops significantly during the movie. At the beginning, she is simply a doctor who becomes the victim of a vampire attack. By the end, she understands the supernatural world and actively participates in the fight against Frost. She becomes braver. She learns how to survive. She begins making decisions under extreme pressure. And she becomes willing to risk herself to help Blade. Her transformation reflects one of the movie's broader themes. Knowledge creates power. Karen begins powerless because she does not understand what she is facing. Once she begins studying the vampire condition, she becomes capable of fighting back. Karen and Blade. Karen's relationship with Blade is also important. At first, Blade sees her primarily as someone who needs protection. But as the story progresses, he begins to recognize her abilities. Karen is not a warrior like Blade. She does not have his physical strength. She does not have his combat experience. But she possesses something Blade does not: scientific expertise. That difference makes them effective partners. Blade understands the battlefield. Karen understands the biology. Whistler provides the equipment. Together, these different strengths create a functioning vampire hunting team. Donal Logue as Quinn. Donal Logue plays Quinn, one of Deacon Frost's longtime enforcers. Quinn is an important supporting villain because he demonstrates the resilience of the vampire characters. He is capable of surviving injuries that would kill lesser vampires. This makes him a particularly persistent enemy. Quinn is not the mastermind. That role belongs to Frost. Instead, Quinn functions as a dangerous enforcer who carries out Frost's orders. His presence reinforces the idea that Frost has built an organization around himself. Frost does not fight alone. He has followers who are willing to attack, capture, and eliminate his enemies. Quinn is one of the strongest examples of that loyalty. Quinn as a physical threat. Quinn's importance is largely connected to his durability. The movie uses him to demonstrate that vampires are difficult to eliminate. An ordinary attack may not be enough. A normal injury may not stop them. This creates a major advantage for Blade's enemies. The Daywalker therefore needs specialized weapons and tactics. Quinn's ability to survive severe injuries also adds dark humor and personality to some of the action. He can return from situations where an ordinary human would never survive. That makes him frustrating for Blade and dangerous to anyone who underestimates him. Udo Kier as Gaetano Dragonetti. Udo Kier plays Gaetano Dragonetti, one of the vampire elders. Dragonetti represents the traditional vampire establishment. Unlike Frost, he does not seek to overthrow the system. He is part of it. The elders believe they have the authority to control vampire society and maintain secrecy from humans. Dragonetti therefore represents tradition, hierarchy, and old vampire power. His presence is especially important because it shows that the vampire world is not unified. There are competing factions. There are old vampires. There are younger vampires. There are pureblood vampires. And there are vampires who were created rather than born. These differences create political tension. Dragonetti and the old vampire order. Dragonetti's position illustrates the arrogance of the pureblood elders. They believe their birth gives them superior status. Frost strongly disagrees. The conflict between them becomes a major part of Frost's motivation. Frost believes that the elders have no right to control his future simply because they were born vampires. This makes the vampire society resemble a rigid political hierarchy. The old leaders want stability. Frost wants revolution. Blade stands outside both groups. He does not care who controls vampire society. He wants the entire threat eliminated. The contrast between the characters. The most effective way to understand these characters is to examine what each one represents. Blade represents choice and discipline. Frost represents ambition and power. Whistler represents loyalty and experience. Karen represents knowledge and adaptation. Quinn represents brute force and loyalty to Frost. Dragonetti represents tradition and hierarchy. These different characteristics create a balanced story. Every character brings something different to the conflict. Blade provides the physical hero. Frost provides the ideological villain. Whistler provides emotional support. Karen provides scientific intelligence. Quinn provides physical opposition. Dragonetti provides the political background of the vampire world. Blade and Whistler, the emotional core. Among all the relationships in the film, Blade and Whistler's bond is arguably one of the most important. Without Whistler, Blade's life would be even more isolated. Whistler is the person who helps Blade survive. He gives him weapons. He gives him knowledge. He gives him advice. And he provides a connection to humanity. Their relationship makes Blade more than an unstoppable killing machine. We understand that there is a person underneath the armor, sunglasses, and weapons. Blade can lose people. He can suffer. He can care. Whistler brings that side of him to the surface. Blade and Karen. Science meets combat. Blade and Karen have a very different relationship. Their partnership is based on necessity and eventually trust. Karen understands the medical side of the vampire condition. Blade understands the practical side. This creates a relationship where each character fills a gap in the other's knowledge. Blade can protect Karen physically. Karen can help Blade understand his condition. This partnership also gives the story a hopeful element. Blade has spent most of his life believing that his condition is something he simply has to endure. Karen introduces the possibility that science might eventually improve his situation. Even though a complete cure is not immediately available, the possibility of a better future exists. Blade and Frost. Two paths for the same difference. The relationship between Blade and Frost is perhaps the most important thematically. Both characters are outsiders. Both possess unusual abilities. Both reject limitations placed upon them. But they choose completely different paths. Blade chooses responsibility. Frost chooses domination. Blade uses his power to protect people. Frost wants to use power to control them. Blade fights his bloodlust. Frost embraces the supernatural world. Blade sees strength as a tool. Frost sees strength as the ultimate goal. Their conflict therefore becomes a battle between two possible versions of what Blade could have become. If Blade had surrendered to his darker instincts, he might have become something closer to Frost. But Blade refuses. That choice defines him. The vampire world through its characters. The supporting characters also help explain the vampire society. Dragonetti shows us the old order. Frost shows us the rebellious younger faction. Quinn shows us the soldiers who enforce Frost's will. Together, they reveal that vampires are not mindless creatures. They have politics. They have social divisions. They have leaders. They have followers. They have competing ambitions. Final character analysis. The strength of Blade comes from the way its characters complement one another. Wesley Snipes' Blade is the center of the story, a hybrid warrior who turns his supernatural abilities into weapons against the creatures responsible for so much suffering. His identity as the Daywalker makes him powerful, but his constant struggle with bloodlust prevents him from becoming an invincible hero without weaknesses. Stephen Dorff's Deacon Frost is the perfect opposite. Frost is ambitious, rebellious, and obsessed with power. He refuses to accept the vampire hierarchy and eventually seeks supernatural power on a scale that could threaten humanity itself. His greatest weakness is the same quality that makes him dangerous: his ambition. Kris Kristofferson's Abraham Whistler provides Blade with guidance, experience, equipment, and emotional support. He is much more than a weaponsmith. He is a father figure who helps keep Blade connected to his humanity. Nebuchadnezzar writes Dr. Karen Jensen brings science into the supernatural conflict. Her journey from an ordinary hematologist to an active participant in the vampire war gives the movie one of its most important character developments. Her scientific discoveries become crucial to understanding and fighting the vampire condition. Donal Logue's Quinn demonstrates the physical resilience of Frost's followers. He represents the dangerous enforcers who allow Frost's organization to function. Udo Kier's Gaetano Dragonetti represents the traditional vampire hierarchy. His character helps establish the political conflict between the old pureblood leadership and Frost's rebellious faction. Together, these characters create a world where every person has a role. Blade is the hunter. Frost is the revolutionary. Whistler is the mentor. Karen is the scientist. Quinn is the enforcer. Dragonetti is the elder. And the conflict between them creates the foundation of the movie. Ultimately, Blade is not memorable simply because of its weapons, action sequences, or supernatural creatures. It remains memorable because its central characters have clear motivations and opposing philosophies. Blade fights to control his nature. Frost fights to unleash his. Whistler fights to protect Blade. Karen fights to understand the vampire condition. The elders fight to preserve their authority, and Frost's followers fight to help their leader reshape the world. That combination gives the movie its distinctive identity. At the center of it all stands Blade, Eric Brooks, the Daywalker. While Wesley Snipes, Blade and Stephen Dorff's Deacon Frost dominate the story, one of the reasons Blade feels like a complete world is the large collection of supporting characters surrounding them. These characters may not receive the same amount of screen time as Blade, but many of them perform an important function. They reveal how vampire society operates, show the dangers faced by ordinary humans, and help make Frost's organization feel like a genuine underground network rather than a group of random monsters. From the swift and dangerous Mercury to the seductive Raquel, from the human servant Krieger to the tragic Dr. Curtis Webb, each character adds another layer to the movie's supernatural world. Some represent the vampire hierarchy, some represent humanity's vulnerability, and others demonstrate the horrifying consequences of becoming involved with Frost. Even characters with relatively small roles contribute to the atmosphere of the film. The world of Blade is not divided simply into good people and bad vampires. There are different levels of loyalty, power, intelligence, and ambition. Some characters actively choose the vampire lifestyle. Others are forced into it. Some humans cooperate with vampires for personal benefit, while others become unwilling victims. That variety makes the supporting cast especially important. Ali Jover as Mercury. Ali Jover plays Mercury, a fast-moving vampire associated with Deacon Frost. Mercury is one of the characters who helps demonstrate the physical abilities of Frost's vampire followers. She is described as fleet-footed, meaning that speed is one of her defining characteristics. In a movie where supernatural strength and speed are major advantages, Mercury represents the agility side of vampire power. She is not presented as a traditional horror creature that simply waits in darkness. Instead, she belongs to Frost's modern vampire circle. Her appearance contributes to the movie's portrayal of vampires as fashionable, dangerous, and deeply integrated into contemporary urban life. Mercury is also one of Frost's lovers, which gives her relationship with him another dimension. Her connection to Frost shows that his organization is not simply a military structure. There are personal relationships inside it as well. Frost surrounds himself with people who are attracted to his confidence, power, and rebellious personality. That charisma is important to understanding why Frost is able to build such a loyal following. Mercury and the modern vampire image. One of the interesting things about Mercury is how far the movie moves away from the traditional image of vampires. She does not look like a creature from an ancient Gothic castle. She belongs in the nightlife environment created by Frost. This is exactly what makes Blade different from many older vampire stories. The vampires have adapted to modern society. They dress in contemporary clothing. They operate businesses. They attend clubs. They use modern technology. They have relationships. And they build social networks. Mercury fits naturally into this environment. Her presence helps make the vampire society feel like a hidden subculture existing alongside ordinary human civilization. Mercury's role in Frost's organization. Mercury's primary importance is connected to Frost. She is part of his inner circle and contributes to the impression that Frost has surrounded himself with capable and loyal vampires. Her speed also makes her a potentially dangerous opponent. Blade's enemies are not slow-moving creatures waiting to be attacked. They can move quickly and react rapidly. That forces Blade to rely on training rather than simply assuming that his supernatural abilities will guarantee victory. Mercury therefore reinforces one of the movie's central ideas. The vampire world is dangerous because its members possess different abilities. Some are physically powerful. Some are fast. Some are intelligent. Some have political influence. Frost knows how to bring those different strengths together. Tracy Lords as Raquel. Tracy Lords plays Raquel, a seductive vampire who helps lure a human man toward the Bloodrave. Her role may be relatively brief, but it is extremely important to the movie's opening world-building. Raquel demonstrates one of the vampire population's most effective weapons: deception. Vampires do not always need to attack humans directly. Sometimes they can use attraction and manipulation. Raquel's appearance and behavior allow her to approach a human without immediately revealing the danger surrounding her. This is a crucial part of the vampire threat. Humans do not necessarily know when they are in danger. The creatures hunting them can look completely ordinary. They can be charming. They can be attractive. They can appear trustworthy. And that makes them even more dangerous. The blood rave. Raquel's role connects directly to one of the most memorable sequences in Blade, the blood rave. The rave is presented as an exciting nightlife event. Music is playing. People are dancing. The atmosphere is energetic. But beneath the surface, something horrifying is happening. The attendees are surrounded by vampires. The scene is important because it reveals the enormous gap between what humans see and what is actually happening. The humans believe they are attending a party. The vampires see them as potential food. Raquel becomes part of the mechanism that brings humans into this dangerous environment. She does not need to force the victim into the club. She makes the situation attractive. That is much more disturbing. Raquel and the theme of seduction. Raquel represents one of the oldest elements of vampire mythology, seduction. The vampire is often portrayed as a creature that can lure humans through attraction, fascination, or temptation. Blade modernizes that concept by placing it inside a nightclub environment. The danger is no longer a mysterious stranger appearing at an isolated mansion. The danger is hidden inside a crowded urban entertainment scene. That makes the concept more contemporary. The vampire world does not need to hide completely. It can exist in plain sight. It simply needs humans to misunderstand what they are seeing. Kevin Patrick Walls as Officer Krieger. Kevin Patrick Walls plays Officer Krieger, a human servant known as a familiar. Krieger is one of the most important examples of how the vampire world influences human society. He is not a vampire. He is human. But he works for Frost. This makes him particularly disturbing because he represents betrayal from within the human world. People are supposed to trust police officers. They are supposed to believe that officers will protect them. Krieger uses that position to help vampires. His loyalty is not to ordinary people. It is to Frost. What is a familiar? In the world of Blade, a familiar is essentially a human servant who works for vampires. These individuals can be extremely valuable. Vampires may possess strength and supernatural abilities, but humans can move through ordinary society more easily. A familiar can access places vampires might avoid. They can interact with police. They can gather information. They can manipulate human systems. They can provide transportation and protection. Krieger therefore represents a bridge between the vampire world and the human world. His existence demonstrates that vampires do not need to control everyone directly. They can recruit humans who are willing to cooperate. Krieger's loyalty to Frost. Krieger is loyal to Frost because the vampire organization provides him with protection and power. But his loyalty ultimately proves dangerous. When Blade captures him, Krieger is forced to reveal information about Frost's activities. This demonstrates that even people working for Frost are vulnerable. Frost's organization is built on fear as much as loyalty. Krieger knows that failure can have deadly consequences. And when he fails Frost, he pays the ultimate price. His fate is a reminder that Frost does not view his followers as equals. They are useful as long as they serve his ambitions. Tim Guine as Dr. Curtis Webb. Tim Guine plays Dr. Curtis Webb, Karen's former boyfriend. Webb's character is particularly tragic because he begins as an ordinary human being. Unlike Frost's followers, Webb does not start as a powerful vampire. His connection to Karen places him inside the human side of the story. But his life takes a horrifying turn. He becomes a victim of the vampire conflict. Quinn kills him, and his body later undergoes an unsuccessful transformation. Instead of becoming a normal vampire, Webb becomes a zombie-like creature. This failed transformation is one of the movie's most disturbing examples of what can happen when the vampire process goes wrong. Webb's transformation. Webb's transformation is significant because it demonstrates that vampirism does not always produce the same result. The vampire condition is not simply a clean transformation from human to supernatural creature. There can be complications. There can be failures. There can be physical deterioration. Webb's body becomes something grotesque and barely recognizable. He is no longer the man Karen once knew. But he is also not a fully functioning vampire. He exists in a disturbing state between life and death. This makes Webb a tragic example of the consequences of the vampire world. Karen's connection to Webb. Webb's connection to Karen makes his transformation even more emotional. He is not a random victim. He is someone she once knew intimately. That creates a painful contrast. Karen is already struggling to understand vampires. Now she has to face the horrifying reality of what happened to someone from her own life. The experience reinforces the danger of the vampire condition. It is not simply something that happens to strangers. It can destroy the lives of people you know. Karen's reaction to Webb also helps show how much she has changed. Earlier, she would have been overwhelmed by such a creature. Now she is forced to defend herself. The zombie-like creature. The appearance of Webb after the failed transformation also expands the film's supernatural mythology. Blade is primarily a vampire story, but this moment introduces an almost zombie-like horror element. Webb's deteriorating body makes the vampire infection feel unpredictable. The movie therefore avoids presenting vampirism as a glamorous supernatural condition. There is beauty and power in the vampire world, but there is also grotesque physical horror. Webb represents the ugly side. He is the reminder that supernatural transformation can result in something terrifying rather than powerful. Sanaa Lathan as Vanessa Brooks. Sanaa Lathan plays Vanessa Brooks, Blade's mother. Her character is one of the most important revelations in the final act. For much of Blade's life, he believes that his mother died after being attacked by a vampire. That event became the foundation of his hatred toward vampires. But later, Blade discovers that Vanessa survived. The revelation changes his understanding of his own past. His mother did not die that night. She became part of the vampire world. And the truth becomes even more painful when Blade learns that Deacon Frost was the vampire who attacked her. Vanessa and Blade's identity. Vanessa is important because she connects Blade's present to his past. Blade has always defined himself through his mission. He is the Daywalker. He is the vampire hunter. He is the enemy of the creatures responsible for his suffering. But Vanessa reminds him that before he became Blade, he was Eric Brooks. He was a child. He was a son. He had a mother. That personal connection makes the final confrontation far more emotional. Blade cannot treat Vanessa as just another vampire. She represents the family history he has spent years trying to understand. Vanessa as a tragic character. Vanessa's transformation is tragic rather than simply villainous. She did not choose to become part of Blade's enemy world in the beginning. She was attacked. She was transformed. She was then absorbed into Frost's world. Her existence demonstrates how vampires can destroy entire families. Blade was not simply fighting individual monsters. He was fighting the system that had taken his mother from him. That realization makes the conflict with Frost even more personal. Eric Edwards as Pearl. Eric Edwards plays Pearl, a vampire archivist who possesses ancient knowledge. Pearl is one of the more unusual figures in the movie. He is physically enormous and described as morbidly obese. His appearance immediately separates him from the sleek and stylish image represented by characters such as Frost and Mercury. Pearl is not primarily a fighter. His importance comes from information. He knows vampire history. He knows ancient legends. And he understands the ritual Frost is attempting to perform. This makes Pearl valuable to Blade. Pearl and the Vampire Archives. Pearl represents the vampire world's connection to history. The vampires have existed for generations. Their society has accumulated ancient knowledge that ordinary humans do not understand. The archives contain information about rituals, bloodlines, supernatural powers, and legends. Frost needs this knowledge to pursue his ambitions. Blade needs it to stop him. Pearl therefore becomes a source of information in the larger conflict. His role demonstrates that knowledge can be just as valuable as physical power. Blade's interrogation of Pearl. When Blade visits Pearl, he needs answers. Pearl does not willingly provide everything Blade wants to know. Blade uses a UV light to force him to cooperate. The scene demonstrates Blade's ruthless determination. He is not interested in traditional interrogation techniques. He knows that Pearl has information that could save lives, and he is willing to use vampire weaknesses against him. Pearl's knowledge eventually reveals Frost's plan involving La Maigre. That information becomes crucial to the final act. Pearl's symbolic role. Pearl also represents the difference between knowledge and action. He knows the history. He understands the legends. But he does not possess Blade's determination. He is essentially a keeper of information. Blade takes that information and turns it into action. This contrast is important. Knowing the enemy is not enough. Someone must be willing to confront it. That is what Blade does. Shannon Lee as the hospital resident. Shannon Lee appears as a hospital resident. Her role is relatively small, but the hospital environment is important to the story. The hospital is supposed to represent safety, science, and modern medicine. But in Blade, even the hospital becomes vulnerable to the vampire threat. The presence of a vampire inside such an ordinary institution demonstrates how deeply the supernatural world has infiltrated human society. The hospital is not an isolated vampire lair. It is a normal place. And that is exactly why the scene works. The hospital and the human world. Karen's profession also makes the hospital particularly significant. She is a medical professional who initially believes in scientific explanations. But the vampire attack forces her to confront something that science, at least initially, cannot easily explain. The hospital therefore becomes the meeting point between two worlds. Human medicine encounters supernatural biology. Karen's scientific knowledge eventually helps bridge the gap. That is one reason her character becomes so important to Blade. Brenda Song as the Chinatown hostage. Brenda Song appears as an uncredited Chinatown hostage. Although the role is small, the character contributes to the movie's broader portrayal of ordinary humans caught in supernatural violence. Not everyone involved in Blade's war is a trained fighter or scientist. Most people are simply civilians. They become victims because they happen to be near vampires. This reinforces the reason Blade continues his crusade. Ordinary people are vulnerable because they do not know what is hunting them. Ordinary humans in Blade's world. The human characters in the movie are important precisely because they do not understand the vampire world. They go to hospitals. They attend clubs. They work normal jobs. They trust police officers. They interact with strangers. But beneath all of this is a hidden supernatural society. This creates tension because the audience knows something the ordinary characters do not. A normal night out can become a nightmare. A police officer may secretly be working for vampires. A medical emergency may actually involve a supernatural infection. A stranger at a nightclub may be hunting for blood. The movie constantly plays with that contrast. The supporting cast as world building. The supporting characters collectively make the world of Blade feel larger. Mercury shows the speed and modern lifestyle of Frost's followers. Raquel shows how vampires can use seduction. Krieger shows how humans can become servants. Webb shows the horrific consequences of failed transformation. Vanessa reveals the personal cost of vampirism. Pearl represents ancient vampire knowledge. The hospital resident and Chinatown hostage represent ordinary people caught in the conflict. Each character reveals another part of the world. That is effective storytelling. Instead of explaining everything through long conversations, the movie allows its characters to demonstrate how the world works. The contrast between beauty and horror. Another important theme among these supporting characters is the contrast between attraction and horror. Characters such as Mercury and Raquel fit the stylish image of the modern vampire. They are attractive, confident, and socially sophisticated. But characters such as Webb and Pearl show a completely different side. Webb is physically deteriorated. Pearl's appearance is intentionally grotesque. This contrast prevents the vampire world from becoming too glamorous. The movie wants viewers to understand that behind the stylish clothing, clubs, and seductive personalities is something genuinely dangerous. The vampire world is not one-dimensional. These characters also show that not all vampires are identical. Some are ambitious. Some are loyal. Some are intelligent. Some are physically powerful. Some are political leaders. Some are followers. Some are simply trying to survive. This variety creates a believable supernatural society. Frost's organization resembles a criminal network. The elders resemble an aristocratic ruling class. The familiars operate like human intermediaries. The archivists preserve history. And the fighters enforce the leader's will. Blade is therefore entering a complete ecosystem rather than fighting isolated monsters. Why these characters matter? It can be easy to overlook supporting characters in an action movie. But without them, the world of Blade would feel much smaller. Mercury helps establish Frost's inner circle. Raquel establishes the danger of the blood rave. Krieger demonstrates that humans can work for vampires. Webb demonstrates the consequences of failed transformation. Vanessa connects the supernatural conflict to Blade's family. Pearl provides the information necessary to understand Frost's ritual. The smaller human roles remind us that ordinary people are constantly at risk. Together, these characters make Blade's mission feel necessary. The emotional impact of the supporting cast. The supporting characters also affect Blade emotionally. Whistler is the most obvious example, but Karen and Vanessa are equally important. Karen represents someone Blade can protect and eventually trust. Vanessa represents the family Blade lost. Frost represents the enemy who caused that loss. Webb represents the horrifying consequences of the vampire world. These relationships prevent Blade from becoming an emotionless action hero. Every fight has a personal connection. Every victory comes with a cost. Final character analysis. The supporting cast of Blade helps turn the movie's vampire mythology into a living world. Ali Jover's Mercury represents the speed, style, and confidence of Frost's modern vampire followers. Tracy Lord's Raquel demonstrates how vampires can use attraction and deception to lure unsuspecting humans into danger. Kevin Patrick Wall's Officer Krieger shows how deeply the vampire world can penetrate human society through familiars and servants. Tim Guinea's Dr. Curtis Webb provides one of the movie's most tragic examples of transformation. His failed conversion into a zombie-like creature shows that the vampire condition can produce horrifying consequences. Sanaa Lathan's Vanessa Brooks gives Blade's story its emotional connection to the past. Her transformation forces Blade to confront the truth about his mother and the origins of his own identity. Eric Edwards' Pearl represents the ancient knowledge preserved by vampire society. His information helps reveal Frost's plan and demonstrates that knowledge can be as powerful as physical strength. Shannon Lee's Hospital Resident and Brenda Song's Chinatown Hostage represent the ordinary people caught in a supernatural conflict they barely understand. Together, these characters reinforce the movie's central idea. The vampire world is hidden, organized, and dangerous. The vampires do not simply attack from dark alleys. They operate clubs. They recruit humans. They maintain archives. They build political factions. They manipulate institutions. They form relationships. They pursue ancient ambitions. And they can transform ordinary people into horrifying creatures. That is why Blade's mission is so important. He is not merely hunting monsters for revenge. He is fighting an underground society that has learned how to exist alongside humanity without being detected. When Blade arrived in 1998, audiences were introduced to a superhero who looked very different from the colorful comic book heroes they were accustomed to seeing on screen. Dressed in black, carrying specialized weapons, moving through dark nightclubs and underground vampire territories, Blade felt closer to a supernatural action hero than a traditional superhero. But the character had actually existed for decades before Wesley Snipes stepped into the role. The movie's production history is fascinating because the filmmakers did not simply transfer the comic book version of Blade directly onto the screen. Instead, they took the foundations of the original character and rebuilt them for a 1990s audience. That transformation changed Blade's personality, appearance, abilities, weapons, fighting style, and even his place within the Marvel Universe. The result was a version of Blade that became far more recognizable to mainstream audiences. And interestingly, the movie's interpretation would later influence the comics themselves. The original Blade was more human. One of the most important differences was Blade's nature. The original comic book character was not initially the half-vampire Daywalker portrayed by Wesley Snipes. Instead, he was essentially a human being with a special immunity to becoming a vampire. That distinction completely changes the character. The movie's Blade possesses supernatural abilities because of his hybrid nature. The original version relied much more heavily on human abilities. He had no effortless supernatural advantage over his enemies. If he wanted to defeat a vampire, he needed preparation, intelligence, courage, and skill. This made the original Blade more of an everyman. He was courageous, but he was not perfect. He had personality flaws. He could be difficult to work with. He could be stubborn. And his hatred of vampires could become almost obsessive. Those imperfections made him more complicated than a traditional flawless hero. Blade's early personality. The original Blade was not necessarily the quiet, controlled warrior audiences came to know through Wesley Snipes. His behavior could be more emotional and confrontational. His hatred of vampires was central to his personality. He had reasons for that hatred, and those reasons drove him toward dangerous situations. This is an important part of understanding how much the film changed. The filmmakers took the basic concept, a determined vampire hunter, and reshaped it into a much more physically imposing and cinematic character. The movie needed a protagonist who could carry an action film. That meant Blade needed to look, move, and fight like someone who could stand against supernatural enemies. The result was a significant evolution. From teakwood knives to a samurai-inspired warrior. One of the most visible changes involved Blade's weapons. In the early comics, Blade used teakwood knives as part of his vampire hunting arsenal. That was consistent with the character's more grounded nature. The movie, however, needed something visually striking. David S. Goyer's screenplay reimagined Blade with a much more elaborate weapon style. His knives were replaced by a sword. The sword became one of Blade's signature visual elements. This was not merely a cosmetic change. It helped define the character's entire physical identity. Blade's movements became more disciplined. His fighting style became more stylized. His appearance took on a samurai-inspired aesthetic. The result was a character who looked immediately recognizable whenever he entered a scene. Why the sword matters. The sword gives Blade a distinctive silhouette. In superhero cinema, visual identity is extremely important. A character should ideally be recognizable even before he speaks. The dark clothing, the sunglasses, the weapons, the sword, the physical confidence. All of these elements combine to create the cinematic Blade. The filmmakers were essentially building a new icon from the comic book foundation. Rather than making Blade look like an ordinary man who hunts vampires, they created the image of a professional supernatural warrior. That decision became one of the movie's most recognizable characteristics. David S. Goyer's reinterpretation. Writer David S. Goyer played a major role in adapting Blade for the big screen. Instead of treating the comic as something that had to be reproduced exactly, Goyer reinterpreted its ideas. The central concept remained intact. Blade is a vampire hunter. But many details were updated. His personality became more restrained. His abilities became more impressive. His weapons became more sophisticated. His visual design became darker. And his relationship with the vampire world became more complicated. This was important because the film was being made for a 1990s audience. The filmmakers wanted Blade to feel contemporary. They were not trying to recreate a 1970s comic book character exactly as he appeared decades earlier. The birth of the Daywalker. Perhaps the biggest change was Blade's transformation into the Daywalker. In the film, Blade is a human-vampire hybrid. He possesses many vampire abilities without suffering from many traditional vampire weaknesses. Most importantly, he can walk in daylight. This gives him his famous nickname. The concept immediately makes Blade unique. Traditional vampires are creatures of darkness. They avoid sunlight. Blade does not have to. That gives him a major advantage over the creatures he hunts. He can enter their world without being limited by one of their most fundamental weaknesses. The Daywalker concept was a major upgrade. From a cinematic perspective, the Daywalker concept solves an important storytelling problem. If Blade were completely human, The audience would constantly have to wonder how he could physically compete with supernatural vampires. The filmmakers could certainly explain his skill and preparation, but an action movie benefits from giving its hero abilities that visually match the threat. The Daywalker solves that problem. Blade can fight vampires on their own level. He can move quickly. He can overpower enemies. He can survive dangerous situations. Yet he still has enough human characteristics to remain emotionally connected to the audience. That combination made him an ideal protagonist for an action-heavy superhero film. The interesting connection to the comics. One of the most fascinating aspects of the character's history is that the film's version eventually influenced the comics. The cinematic Blade became so recognizable that later comic book stories incorporated elements associated with the movie. This is an unusual example of adaptation working in both directions. Normally, a comic book influences the film. Here, the film's reinterpretation also influenced the source material. The Daywalker concept became strongly associated with Blade. The sword became an important part of his visual identity. His darker personality became more familiar to audiences. And the cinematic version effectively helped redefine the character for a new generation. Why the 1990s needed a different Blade. The entertainment landscape of the 1990s was very different from the 1970s. Audiences were becoming increasingly familiar with action heroes who were physically powerful, visually distinctive, and morally complicated. The superhero genre was also evolving. Filmmakers needed to demonstrate that comic book characters could work in different genres. Blade therefore leaned heavily into action, horror, martial arts, and supernatural thriller elements. The movie did not feel like a brightly colored comic book brought to life. It felt like a dark urban action movie with a supernatural mythology. That tone was a major part of its identity. A darker superhero aesthetic. The production team created a world filled with darkness. Nightclubs. Abandoned locations. Underground vampire gatherings. Shadowy rooms. Ancient temples. Blood rituals. Specialized weapons. This aesthetic separated Blade from many superhero movies of its era. The movie did not need to constantly remind viewers that it was based on a comic book. Instead, it built its own atmosphere. The vampire world felt hidden beneath ordinary society. That helped the movie appeal not only to comic book fans but also to audiences interested in action and horror. Blade as a martial arts hero. Another major production decision was to emphasize martial arts. Wesley Snipes was already known for his physical abilities and action performances. That made him a natural fit for the role. The film could therefore turn Blade into a highly trained combatant. His fights are not simply demonstrations of supernatural strength. They are choreographed around movement, timing, weapons, and technique. The samurai-inspired aesthetic complements this approach. Blade moves like a trained warrior rather than a conventional superhero. His fighting style becomes part of his identity. The visual language of Blade. The production design also helped create the character's image. Blade's black clothing immediately communicates seriousness. His sunglasses give him a distinctive silhouette. His weapons suggest preparation. His posture communicates confidence. He rarely looks like someone who has accidentally become involved in a supernatural conflict. He looks like someone who has prepared for it his entire life. That visual storytelling is extremely effective. Before Blade explains who he is, the audience can already understand something about him. He is a hunter. He is prepared. And he is dangerous. Reimagining Deacon Frost. Blade was not the only character changed for the movie. Deacon Frost was also significantly reimagined. The comic book version was different from the film's interpretation. The movie's Frost, played by Dorff, is younger, more stylish, rebellious, and ambitious. He is not simply a traditional vampire villain. He is an outsider within vampire society. The pureblood elders consider him inferior. But Frost refuses to accept that judgment. Instead, he wants to challenge the entire hierarchy. Frost's ambition remains. Despite the changes, one important characteristic was preserved. Frost remains ambitious. That is one of the strongest connections between the comic book character and the film interpretation. He wants more power. He wants greater influence. He wants to overcome the limitations imposed upon him. The movie expands this ambition into a larger plan involving vampire mythology and the awakening of La Maigre. This gives Frost a much bigger role. He becomes the central villain driving the story forward. The movie's Frost is more contemporary. The filmmakers clearly wanted Frost to feel like a product of the modern world. He does not behave like an old-fashioned gothic vampire. He is confident. He is charismatic. He is rebellious. He operates in clubs and modern urban environments. He surrounds himself with younger followers. He challenges the authority of older vampires. This makes him a natural opponent for Blade. Blade is also a modernized supernatural character. The two therefore belong to the same contemporary world. Their conflict feels like a collision between two powerful outsiders. The vampire society was expanded. The film also expanded the concept of vampire society. Instead of presenting all vampires as one unified group, the story created different factions. There are pureblood elders. There are younger vampires. There are vampires associated with Frost. There are human familiars. This creates political tension. Frost does not simply want to destroy humanity. He also wants to overthrow the vampires who control his own society. That makes the conflict more complicated. There is conflict between humans and vampires. But there is also conflict among vampires. Pureblood versus turned vampires. The hierarchy within vampire society becomes one of the movie's important world-building ideas. The pureblood vampires consider themselves superior. They were born into the vampire world. Frost and his faction do not possess that same status. Rather than accepting their inferior position, Frost becomes determined to change the system. His rebellion is therefore partly political. He wants to destroy the old order. But his ambition goes much further. He wants supernatural power that will allow him to dominate both vampires and humans. A modern interpretation of vampire mythology. The movie's production also involved adapting traditional vampire mythology for modern audiences. Sunlight remains dangerous. Silver remains useful. Blood remains central. But these concepts are presented through modern technology and action filmmaking. Blade's weapons are specialized. His hideout resembles a modern combat facility. His enemies operate businesses and nightclubs. Science becomes important through Karen's research. This combination of ancient mythology and modern technology gives Blade its unique identity. Science meets supernatural horror.